initially that it's very important for one to cultivate pure motivation. That very pure motivation is really altruistic mind, attitude, which you cultivate in a sense that by the virtue of receiving such teaching, that may such benefit be happens or possible upon all living beings. And with that intention or motive, one must pay attention towards the teachings. In all form of tradition of the practice, and in every even different religion, that essential goal or the purpose of those practice of the different religion or different tradition is really aimed towards separating oneself or that of the beings from the very suffering and experience the sacred happiness. With such aim or purpose, then there exist many different traditions, different methods to actualize that very purpose or goal of separating suffering and pain, misfortune and mishaps, and to experience happiness. As such, that in every religion, as we explained, to separate from the suffering and to experience happiness, and particularly as from the Buddhist viewpoint, that all beings do not only wish to separate from the suffering and experience the sacred happiness, but all beings are again putting tremendous effort in trying to get rid of or separate from the suffering. In various methods, trying to apply all various methods. At the same time, all beings are putting a tremendous effort again to experience, to realize the happiness. So they are not only that with the intention, but rather put extreme energy or effort in separating from suffering and in order to experience happiness. However, regardless of the effort that they put into trying to get rid of the suffering and obtain happiness, not many experience the happiness or not many able to get rid of the suffering. The reason why, despite of such effort, why they do not achieve the goal of experiencing happiness is that they have no knowledge of first what is suffering. Secondly, they have no knowledge of the what causes suffering, or rather the very origin of suffering. And they have not clear understanding or perception of what is happiness that they are seeking. And the happiness or the ultimate happiness. What is ultimate happiness? As a lack of all those knowledge, despite of that tremendous effort, one never achieves the purpose. Is that having the five skandhas, the aggregates, that very five skandha or aggregates, we take it so seriously and believe or label that very aggregate or the five skandha as ego or self, I. And the result to having taken it extremely serious and labeled it ego or me, self, Therefore, having grasped, attached to that existence of self in the five skandha, that leads us or that causes us to experience the sufferings. So the rest of suffering, the suffering of suffering and the suffering of changes is very much is there, but the reason why the first suffering is known as pervasive conditioned existence of suffering is that the reason why it is pervasive, that suffering exists in all the rest of the suffering of change and suffering of the suffering, and as the moment you have formed, obtained the aggregate or the skandha and labeled it as me, self, that suffering is pervaded. So therefore it is known as the pervasive conditioned suffering. So that very pervasive conditioned suffering is, as explained, very much the ground of all the pain and suffering. Since that pervasive pain and suffering exists, the second reason of why it's called as the suffering of suffering or suffering plus suffering is that in addition to that very ground, the suffering of believing of the existence of self within the five skandhas, then after that you experience all sort of again suffering, such as birth, old age, sickness, death, based upon believing existence of self or ego. It is known as suffering of suffering or suffering plus suffering, because the ground suffering of that pervasive suffering is being there. On top of that, one undergoes the suffering of birth, old age, sickness, and many other misfortunes. Then there is also the suffering of change, that one cannot remain as it is. Even if you are in a state of tremendous bliss or happiness, but that very happiness or bliss is momentary. It's not permanent. That changes. And not only that, physically, from the moment of our birth, as we grow, that not only the physical growing of the change, but the state of our mind and experience of the ups and downs are all changes. And sometimes we fail to understand that very root or the ground of the suffering, which we talk of the pervasive conditioned suffering. We fail to recognize that, but we simply believe that all the pain and suffering comes from the changes that we are experiencing, changes of ups and downs. But the actual reason of the suffering of the ups and downs or change is because that the ground, the very foundation suffering of the pervasive conditioned existence, believing in the ego, existence of ego or self, upon the aggregates or the skandha, led us to go through all the rest of the suffering. The suffering of suffering, suffering of change are really a branch of the pervasive conditioned suffering. So in failing to recognize the very root cause of the suffering, then as such that we develop a tremendous fear. In every moment we experience some changes occurring in our life, because we also believe or take the notion that very change which we explained earlier is also momentary. But generally and so one experiences a fear through such a reason, and also sometimes the reason of experiencing a tremendous fear is that whatever you were experiencing before, that you believed that is sort of permanent or eternal, and very much grasped to the idea that is true, real, permanent. So as everything is subjected to change, when change occurs, you realize it did not remain within you according to your belief as the permanent. Therefore, again, you develop a tremendous fear. Every change or the suffering of change that we explained are really happening externally. Our ultimate nature, inner being, is not really changing, but we fail to recognize that, and the external change, we take it so seriously. Through that, we develop unnecessary fear, which is bothersome to mind. The greatest change we all have to undergo, that is bothersome to every one of us. To every one of us is the death. Besides, of course, there are many changes that is unfavorable to oneself, but the greatest change that we all feel uncomfortable, that is very much bothersome, that is very much frightening, is the death. In the idea of the death, that again one sometimes develops such a tremendous phobia, death phobia, specifically not knowing what happens after the death. One believes when you die, that is the end of everything. That is total final, and you don't know what happens, and therefore one has a tremendous sense of frightful ideas, feelings of the idea of the end, idea of the final of the life. But actually, death does not mean the end of such cessation of everything. So therefore it is necessary to define the whole idea of death in the Buddhist philosophy, that presently when we have a body which is the aggregate or component of the element and what we call as physical form of body, within that body the mind is such that there is relation or connection between the body and mind. If you ask, is the mind a body? No. And if you ask, is body that mind? No. But they do have connection at present moment, as long as we have this physical form, that there is a connection or interdependent. And as such, as long as there is the connection and we have this aggregate of the form, body, we are living being, not dead. And again, as our physical body, the component, as we said, is the component of the element and atom, which is the subjected to deterioration, which is subjected to collapse, because it is the external interdependent connection, and when that breaks or collapses, the very mind, or another term, a synonym for such is the consciousness, separates from that body that it had connection with before. So that separation, the mind or consciousness, separation from the very body, is regarded as death. But the mind or the consciousness did not collapse. The consciousness or mind's continuation is always there, so it is ceaseless. The mind is deathless. So therefore, that death really happens upon a body that never experienced by the mind. But of course, when the mind is separated from the very body, we call it death. But again, if one understands the Tibetan words of the body, then one can get a better picture of why body is named a special name in Tibetan. In Tibetan, the body is Lu. Lu means Really the literal meaning of Lu in simple English, and I'll give you another English, the simple English is left behind. The body is left behind. That is the name of body. Or another term is rejecting the body. Because when the mind has rejected, or when it collapses, the mind has to leave it behind. So whole the name of body is left behind. So mind leaves body, as body is unable to maintain because it has to experience the change as it is conditioned to the change, as it is also the component of the element and the atom. And as such, again, one must not misunderstand the fact the mind does not die because it is tremendously powerful, strong and hard substance. It cannot collapse. Mind has no substance or hard, concrete substance at all. Yet, when we talk about the mind not having any concrete, hard substance, it's not a complete void or emptiness. The mind has that very quality to understand, comprehend, to aware. That emptiness nature has a very much quality of the wisdom, awareness. And within all those understanding, then what we take the death as really very much the physical deterioration. And as we have talked earlier, all the problem developed by labeling, believing in the ego or self. To that very physical body, which is the component of the element and the atom, again, who labeled it is the existence of me or self is that mind labeled it the self. So when you experience the change, when you experience the deterioration of your body, and particularly experience the death, you feel, I am dying. But the mind who has really labeled, that never dies. But again, when we talk about mind not dying, it does not take birth either. It never died. How could it take birth? It continues. So the mind just has the continuation of such, but simply leaves the body. And so it is thought the body was just, he borrowed the body of physical form, and leaving that, it continues and goes forward. Goes on, sorry. So it is very important to really recognize the cause of suffering. What leads us to experience those uncomfortable situations, fear, and any type of pain and suffering. And as such, that based upon our physical form or body again, that we are experiencing many different pain and suffering in our modern world, particularly different illness, incurable illness, disease. Experiencing such pain of the incurable disease, that one must learn, of course, that to understand the fact or the very much the idea of, as we talked earlier, the idea of the death and so forth. Otherwise, first one has pain, suffering of the disease itself, whatever disease, the incurable disease one has caught. Secondly, that disease leads one to experience a depth of pain and suffering towards the knowing, since this is an incurable disease, that you are bound to experience death. So that very disease or incurable disease plus the pain of disease led you to experience the second suffering of, you know you're going to die, and as with that knowledge you become tremendously sensitive towards the every situation, and every situation it becomes uncomfortable and painful for oneself. And particularly one is extremely sensitive towards the every pain at the moment of death, if one do not learn to look at it in the positive way.
아니 베트카야 제메 터도 잡스 딱 한칸 매면 잡스 성비요.
So if one does not look at it positive ways, then one thinks that that is the very end. And one must also look at it from 2 points. The first point, one learn or one must know that worrying about the disease, worrying in particular about this death is no benefit. It does not sort of stop you from not dying. First point. The second is that if you do not learn to develop some positive thinking at the moment of death, again, at that time, that you have become tremendously sensitive, that everything becomes tremendously painful. The reason why one really develops fear, uncomfortable situation, and becomes tremendously sensitive at that moment is that, again, believing that is the last and final of such, which is, we explained earlier, which is not that mind continues after death. As an evidence of that mind does not cease there at the moment of death, and mind as evidence of the continuation of the mind, in the Buddhist philosophy, there is the Bardo, which is the intermediate state after death between the rebirth. So that proves the whole idea of the continuation of the mind not experiencing death, and therefore it is not end of that mind. As such, the Buddhist does not only present you that there is an intermediate state after death, but also Buddhism provides a method, technique, that during that state, intermediate state after death, between rebirth, your mind is capable of experiencing various different things. And as a result of such, Buddhism provides a method to also liberate at that moment after death. If one, again, is acknowledged, informed well of such a remedy, such a method, that very method is so skillful, so supreme, and the liberation is such possible at that moment that it is even more possible, so to speak, at the living state of when we have body, then at the Bardo state, applying such method, the liberation is more possible if one is really well acquainted with such a technique or method.
Yeah,
So the very experience of the Bardo state or intermediate state happens to everybody, to the Buddhist or to non-Buddhist. It should not be regarded as such that it is only the Bardo state is experienced towards the only Buddhism and so forth. And the reason why, again, that it was explained earlier that the technique or the method of the liberation during the Bardo state is greater than during a living state when we have this body, is that when we are alive, when we have body, that mind is dependent, or mind has that developed a connection to a solid form, which we call its body, to this solid form, which is the component of the aggregates or the skandha. And since mind has that very connection, a bond between the body and mind at living state, one has all the conflicting emotions such as the tremendous attachment, grasping towards that connection of body and mind to body and of the rest of the external phenomena. As a result to that tremendous attachment and grasping, regardless of how much again one is motivated toward the understanding, recognizing the nature of mind as a power of the attachment, that it becomes harder to go deep into really experiencing the very nature of the mind. And in addition to that, when we have a physical form, that we are very much again attuned. We are very much again grasping and attached to all the physical sensations that we experience, and those does prevent. And a result to that, we are unable to concentrate even one moment without the distraction, and we are unable to concentrate one moment without the distraction. So where there is distraction, one cannot possibly recognize the nature of mind. And in addition to those all distractions, that when during our living state, we have a tremendous expectation. We have again tremendous fear, expectation towards the material success, so forth, fame, possession and wealth. And we have also fear of every situation in samsara, particularly now as our subject is being on disease and illness, all those fear, and in short, any suffering, any type of suffering. So we are constantly again dealing with the hope or expectation and fear. And so as such that during our living state, when we have this body, that even if one try to struggle toward the enlightenment, applying various technique of the meditation, various means, with effort and diligence, that it is still harder because we are depending upon the physical form, and we are being constantly distracted by the senses, physical senses, and also that interrupted or hindered by the fear and expectation. Whereas that during this state of the Bardo, there is no this solid physical body that mind depends on. And in addition to that, the actual experience that there is no struggle toward experiencing the ultimate nature of the mind, that it happens or it is there effortlessly. And in our living state, one has to put a tremendous effort to really experience, to get into that state of the ultimate nature. But whereas during this Bardo state, you are there in very much in ultimate state. And speaking about the Bardo state, of course there are many different states or levels, which Rinpoche will be speaking about the different level of Bardo, first stage, second stage, so forth this afternoon. But basically right now, that Rinpoche wants you to understand that why it was said that in Bardo state the possibility of the liberation is greater, is that it is a question of recognizing that very ultimate state that you are in. You are there effortlessly, but if you do not recognize, then you are unable to experience. But if you recognize right there, so it becomes so effortless in the Bardo state. So of course that there are not a single being who is not subjected to the birth, old age, sickness and death. But the whole point of the talk is that we are not saying that we are not subjected to birth, old age, sickness and death, but rather those things, particularly but rather that we try to learn to understand or look at in a better way, that all those things, particularly sickness and death, should not overwhelm our mind. And not being overwhelmed, that one and one must know or learn how to deal with that very fact of birth, old age, sickness and death particularly. And in addition to such, always understanding that the ultimate nature is there when you're alive or when you're dead. So that becomes very important part to believe or understand rather than being totally overwhelmed by the whole idea of sickness and death. And now there's some time for the questions. Yes?
It would seem like when you, at the moment of death, when you're just consciousness and you don't have a body anymore, and you can't breathe or see, or I could just suppose these things, how can you recognize what's going on? How can you know what to do?
The majority of people believing that all the capacity of our five senses, ability to see, ability to hear, ability to smell, taste, and so forth, is very much with the physical doors or openings such as eye and ear. And so when they lose such at the time of death, as majority believing that, they developed, as we talked earlier, develop a tremendous sense of fear of how could we recognize, what would see, who would experience, since we do not have eye and ear to hear at that moment. That is exactly what is the weakness of not knowing the quality, the nature of the mind. Mind's quality or capacity is beyond any imagination. And because of that, at present, our capacity of the senses, ability to see, is limited. Limited in a sense when you just put something across your eyes, that limits your vision. It's limited. But at the time of death, the nature of the actual mind's capacity is that it is limitless. Its capacity to understand, the capacity to see becomes so limitless, nothing can really prevent. So that is the quality of the mind, which is always defined as luminosity, clear, because it is so clear and luminous. So the unimaginable quality of the mind is there when you have again recognized ultimate nature of the mind. If one is dealing with the ordinary state, unable to recognize very nature or the ultimate mind, still the mind has what is called as imaginary body that time, which is not again like a flesh, blood and bone that we have now, but very similar to the very formation that we have now. That imagination body or imaginary body exists at the state of Bardo. That is referred to the, again, when you are in the state of, when you have not recognized the ultimate nature of mind, and thereafter, as a result of the habitual patterns in this life and that of previous life, you have that imaginary body.
Until you find the physical body.
Perhaps this will be explained later too, but the imagination body you speak of at the time of death, or shortly after the time of death, will that be used in deity practice during the Bardo? That imagination body that we have?
Yes, that again, the Bardo here is divided or classified into 3 levels. And again, which will explain more detailedly after noon, but generally on the first and second stage of the Bardo, that one is really dealing with the natural state of mind without the imaginative body, first and second stage. And that is the principally upon the purity of the mind. But when one fails to recognize that very natural state of the ultimate mind on the first and second stage, on the third stage of Bardo, then one again that experiences which is known as the Bardo of existence. Every habitual pattern, every experience that you have had in this lifetime of existence returns, and therefore as such you develop that imaginative body form, and everything becomes very similar, or experience becomes very similar during the state where you are in this samsara. And from there onward, as next, which explains then the consciousness or this mind sometimes again seeks rebirth, and so it goes from that Bardo of existence to the birthing.
You spoke that the images during the Bardo, that everyone has the same images. People have reported in after-death experiences, or when they near-death experiences, different images. For example, Christians, people who are Christians during their life, when they feel they're dying, would see Christian images. Can you comment on that?
That really supports everything that we have been saying this morning, that it does not really contradict to the Bardo state, and it actually supports the idea that after death, that the consciousness or the mind continues, and there is the experience, and the experience is possible of many different aspects of the experience, and the whole the yidam or deity that you see on the Thangka painting or such must not look at them as a Tibetan tradition. Because it is not Tibetan tradition, we do not see any in Tibet, those sort of yidams running in the country of Tibet. So therefore, it is understood it's not Tibetan tradition, but at the same time, it must be also understood that at the time or after death, you only experience exactly the way it is on the Thangka painting. The whole idea is here, after death or Bardo state, is that there is Bardo state where the mind never dies. It has the capacity to experience all different aspects, and so therefore... And in short, that mind, essential nature of mind doesn't cease. So that's suppose. And what you experience is not the really question. The question after death, what you are experiencing or what form, and is not the question. What is the question here is that mind does not cease, and as a result of such, they experience.
Yeah.
What is the relationship between the mind and the brain? A disappearance of awareness, insight, and in some cases consciousness.
That's again exactly as explained earlier, that during the living state, when we are living, as explained that the possibility of experiencing the ultimate or the natural state of mind was less, because when we are alive, as we have explained, although the mind has that unimaginable quality of understanding, knowing everything, knowing everything on its, it has that quality. But when we are alive, as we have explained earlier, that mind has developed a relationship with body. As such, having developed a relationship with the body, although it has all the quality of knowing, understanding everything, it has to function through the body, having developed that relationship. And therefore, functioning through body, in another words, is at present, when we are alive, that mind is dependent on the function or dependent on the body. Therefore, as the mind is dependent on the body, although mind itself do not experience any defects, but due to some defect of the nerve system, as the physical body, the principal part of our body, which is like a brain, when any misfunction of the nerve system leads one, prevents one to experience the better understanding or incapable of such many things, because the mind has to function through the body. But mind itself has not really experienced any defect out of such, but the body's system has experienced the defect, therefore it cannot function as naturally or as normal. Someone who is born with a mentally disturbed condition, or after birth they unfortunately experienced such a disease that led to again imbalance of a mental, and as such throughout their life, from early childhood or from the birth until death, that they were imbalanced mentally, or this person is imbalanced mentally. Now again, in the East, by the virtue of Dharma, when any individual dies, that they always calls a teacher or lama, as you are familiar with, requesting them to introduce this individual to the Bardo state, and also doing prayer, sadhanas of many such. And again, explaining about death, that death takes upon oneself in a very gradual step, which is called that outer breath when it sees that inner death is not happened, but when the breath ceases, it is not, that person is not completely dead. So as such that if you examine carefully that capacity of the person, reaction, the capacity of the person's understanding in their normal life, because of being imbalanced, they could not take, they could not understand, they could not comprehend what the teacher said in the normal life. But at the moment of the death, particularly when the external, the breath is being seized, but the inner such a death is not occurred, the person becomes totally normal and comprehending every teaching. It shows that that moment, the separation between mind and body is occurring. Before that, as we have talked earlier, that mind being needing to depend on body or body's system, it could not function normally. And now, in about or in a state of the separation, one could function on its own, on the mind's aspect, without depending upon the system of body. So that is the total evidence such that mind remains undefected from such. Last question.
When you were talking about the brain and the mind, I have a question about, there's a place within the brain that we perceive memory. If that part of the brain is destroyed, every moment feels like the first moment of awakening. There's a place in our brain where we perceive emotion, and that has to be in harmony with other parts of our brain. When we die, recognizing that the mind is separate from the body, how are the perceptions different? Does it still have the same aspects?
Could you define more, explain more about the awakening state of the brain when it's removed? If there is such surgery, I would like to go faster. But could you explain it to me?
I see, and I'm a very visual person, and I I use my eyes a lot. That has to do with a certain function of my brain. If that function in my brain is removed, I wouldn't be able to see. When we go through the death state and the Bardo, would my mind, the ultimate mind, still use the function of sight?
The period when we are alive, even with the knowledge that mind and body are not one, even with the understanding that they are separate, would not help you to function mind on its own, because we are alive and therefore mind has that connection or dependence upon the body. Mind has to function through. Function to the body. Through, I don't know this preposition whether it's proper to use, but from or through the body. And the reason why mind has to function to the body is that it has developed that connection and that bond between the body and mind. So at present, the experience of seeing happens since the mind is dependent on the body through the eye, the eyeball. But the seeing is not really happening from the eyeballs. The seeing is possible. The mind has that capacity to be aware, to understand without the eyeballs. So, as such, that mind is so dependent or function to body that our present state of experience deals with very much three aspects. Eye, that you think through eye, you are able to see. Now you have to have an object that I can see. And then there's the consciousness of the meeting of the object and your vision and experiencing, I have seen. So it happens in the three levels: see, the object of see, what you have seen, and experience that settles down as seer. That happens because we have a relation or the grasping